Hello, my name's James Birnie, and here's a picture of me talking in Belgium last year. Now, before I go, I just want to introduce you to my film crew. Thank you very much. Here's our film crew today. These are my daughters. That's Felicity with the bear ears, and that's Clementine standing there. Right, there you go, Clementine. You can film the rest of this now. So, last year, I spoke about how agile is a dirty word. And when I was in the Ukraine, in Kyiv, in November, I also spoke about agile as a dirty word. And here's a picture of me in Ukraine. This is my friend David Leitner, who was speaking at the conference. This is David's friend, whose name I've completely forgotten. And this guy here, none of us know who he is. We've got absolutely no idea. Well, and here's me on the stage talking about quantum computing. Unfortunately, the photographer didn't come to agile as a dirty word, so I've got no evidence of that having happened in Ukraine, but believe me, it did. Well, a lot happens in a year. There's my old title slide. There's my old employer, ThoughtWorks. I no longer work for ThoughtWorks. I now work for Codurance. Now, that means that my title slide has to change and get rid of all the branding. There it is. But there's one thing that hasn't changed in the last year, and that is that agile is still a dirty word.
Right. So after all that, okay. So a year ago, I did a talk called Agile is a Dirty Word. And what we were talking about a year ago was how all of the deliveries I've worked in over the last 5, 10, 15 years, Agile has a bad name. And it was mainly a bit of a rant. Those that were here earlier this afternoon saw me ranting about estimates. I didn't offer all that many solutions. But I feel like in the last year or so, actually, I've learned a lot about how to improve that situation and how to move things on. And we did a lot of work at ThoughtWorks and then latterly Codurance on that. So, before I crack into the meat, I'm going to start with, this is a great British tradition, which we do in pubs. Is pub quiz a thing outside of the UK? No? Yeah? Well, we'll have a quiz then. Anybody that saw the talk last year will know the answer to this. Okay, so I do have prizes. They're down there somewhere. I've got 3 bottles of beer to give away. The other one I'll be drinking myself. So, does anybody know what country that is? Laos. It's Laos, but I'm not giving you anything, Fiona, because you've seen the talk before. Algeria, good. This isn't the quiz part. Oh, I've lost the screen now. Everything's going wrong. This one? Congo, good. That is Timor-Leste, East Timor. Ethiopia. It's the dark green bit. North Korea. Sri Lanka, yeah. And this is the last one. Okay, now this is the bit that you can get a free beer on. Who can tell me what those countries have in common? Come on. They're not agile enough. Probably not. Sorry, anybody? Anybody? No, okay. They are the 8 countries in the world that have the word democratic in their official name. Is that 8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Does anybody think those countries are democratic? I'm tempted to give you a beer for the joke, but unfortunately it didn't make me laugh enough. Okay. Well, there is something called the Democracy Index. So let's have a look to see how democratic these countries are. Oh dear. So out of the 167 countries measured, North Korea is the worst. Well, there's a couple of flawed democracies there. Okay, for reference sake, free beer for whoever can tell me what number 1 on the list is, the world's most democratic country. No. Sorry, one at a time. Vietnam, no. No. No, not Venezuela. Who said Norway? Fucking hell, Fiona, what sort do you want? Free dark beer. She wins. Number 1 on the list. Kingdom of Norway, interestingly. Does anybody want to shed a guess where the UK might be? Huh? UK, number 14 out of 167. Now, normally when I do this talk abroad, I'll look up the country that I'm talking in and see where they're fitting. But occasionally when I do that, I think if I actually mention it, it might be seen as passive-aggressive and somebody might murder me. So in this case, I'm going to ask where people think the USA might be on the list. Not bad. They're in at number 25. Now, why am I bothering with this? I mean, there's obviously an Agile connection. My point is, why do these countries think they have to tell the world that they're democratic? Who are they trying to kid? Why do they go and do that? It reminds me of the Eastern Bloc when we had the Democratic Republic of Germany, the Democratic Republic of Romania and everybody. Well, Ukraine doesn't claim to be democratic. So my point is, whenever we see adverts or we see, as I've seen a lot in my working life, we see CTOs who tell us, well, you know what, we're doing Agile. What I've discovered is when people say that, they're really not. So this is something I've come across a lot in my life. So she's the CTO and she's telling us, you know, how they're doing all the right things and they haven't seen the results. So why is Agile still a dirty world? I'm going to talk a little bit about dysfunction that we see. I'm looking around in the room wondering, so I've worked in software since the mid-1990s. These are the kind of things that I remember seeing. So this is kind of before my time, but I'm just saying at some point in history, probably around about the time that the Mythical Man Month was written, all our software deliveries failed. They were all waterfall, right? We know that worked. So in around about the mid to late 90s, someone said, you know what, I've heard this XP thing's really good. We should try it. We should give it a go. Then later on, maybe a couple of years, maybe a few more years later, they're still failing at delivery. So what's their inescapable conclusion? Oh, XP must be crap. Let's move on to something new. Then Agile comes along. Everybody jumps on this Agile bandwagon. But you know what they do? They retrain their project managers as Scrum Masters. Job done. We're Agile. And what then happens? Oh, all of our Agile projects are failing now. So you know what that means? Well, Agile must be crap. That's where we are now. Everybody's blaming Agile because it's the latest thing that we're using to still make our software projects fail. So what was the common thing in that last slide? Well, let's drill into it. These are some of the new graphics that I got on my new company. Software deliveries failing is in pretty much every sentence. It's there, it's in the title, and it's there 3 times. There's a first-person pronoun in there 8 times. So what's that telling us? Is it telling us that Agile is failing? Is it telling us that XP is failing? Or is it telling us that our software deliveries fail? Right? So maybe we're the problem. Maybe it's my organization that's the problem. Maybe it's not Agile. Maybe Agile is just the latest target for what we're saying, because that is the latest thing that we're shit at. I do know organizations whose deliveries aren't failing. Let's come on to those later. Okay, so what does dirty look like? So I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. What we often see is a cycle of declining trust. Something bad happens. Somebody comes along. I've just realized I've misplaced my pointer clicky thing. Oh, I left it down there. Somebody says, let's standardize our tools. And they did it in a way that made my slide look rubbish. Or maybe they said, let's introduce some kind of standard process. They did something because they didn't trust the developers anymore. And then those tools, those processes, that thing, it doesn't work for everybody, right? So the developers now, they can't get stuff done. They've made the problem worse. So what does that mean? Well, more bad things happen over and over and over again. And people are just left saying, we don't trust our developers. That's a common dysfunction. When I was working just 3 weeks ago, the company I was working for, they're in danger of losing their biggest client. And I put together a thing to try and present to this client to say, this is how we're going to take you forward. We need to rebuild trust. And I put together this thing and I took it to my client and said, I think something like this happened. Our business has lost confidence in us because we can't release new features, because we don't have confidence that it will be successful, because we can't get the right of automated testing, because we don't have the right tooling. Our QA function and developers are too far away from the customer. It's causing far too large feedback loops. We've got less confidence in our system. We've got a vicious cycle of declining trust. We need to break out of that cycle. This is the type of thing that happens in any organization, and this is where Agile gets the blame, because that's the thing we're doing. Here's another big bang cycle of fear. I think we've probably all experienced this at some point, probably maybe not the youngest people in the room. At some point, somebody does a release that goes wrong. As you can see, I released these slides and they went wrong. It's when you convert from Google Slides to PowerPoint. I didn't have enough time to check if the fonts go wrong. So the bad release happens. What happens? Somebody comes along and says, we need more testing. They add all these layers of testing, which might have seemed like a reasonable response 20 years ago or maybe 10 years ago. But what does it do now if you add a load more testing at the end of every release? Oh, geez, that looks terrible. That should say longer cycle times. There wasn't enough testing on this deck, obviously. So it causes your cycle times to get much longer. What does that mean? You release more stuff. Your releases are getting bigger and bigger and inescapably bigger. They need more testing. Every time your release gets bigger, what does that mean? It's more risky. What does that mean? You do more bad releases. You do bad release on top of bad release on top of bad release. This type of cycle, just like the cycle of declining trust, that's what we need to break out of. We need to find ways to break out of there. It doesn't matter what methodology you're using, whether you think you're doing XP, whether you're doing a form of Agile, whether you're doing whatever, whether you're doing waterfall. These types of cycles of declining trust occur everywhere. It's important to separate them, I think, from how you got there. And those are the real problems that we need to solve. Excuse me, need to irrigate my throat. I've got a bit of a cold. So a consequence of all of these regulations, all of these testing, all of this stuff going wrong is people add new process. What does that mean? We end up with something that I'm fond of calling risk management theatre. Has anybody heard of this phrase before? Risk management theatre? Yeah, one or two. Yeah, it's on my blog. I didn't invent the phrase, by the way. Somebody invents a process. It might be a reasonable process at the time it was invented, but now it's not. But a whole team grew up to support that process. The process started ruling what was going on in the business. The tail started wagging the dog. 10 years down the road, nobody can even remember what the thing was that process was supposed to do. It probably had a reason once, but nobody really knows. And more importantly, there's a whole team or even a whole industry built up around running that process. Everybody's forgotten what the outcome was that it was driving towards, but nobody can get rid of it. Nobody even knows who owns it. That's risk management theatre, and it doesn't just exist in software delivery. It exists everywhere in life. This is an example of risk management theatre, this picture. This was at Euston Station in London. There's a big hoarding thing up around some works going on in the station. There's a sticker on it saying, we've certified this fully complies with Network Rail Managed Stations Hoarding Specification NR/L3/OPS/045.5.04 Management of Station Works Procedure. How does that notice being on that hoarding make it any safer? How does that notice being on that hoarding make it any less risky? It's beyond me. But that's typical risk management theatre. So's this. I live in a place just outside of London called Hemel Hempstead. I was walking into town with one of my daughters one day and I saw this. I saw this massive construction. Can everybody read that notice? It says caution broken glass. So one has to assume that there's some broken glass in that picture. Can everybody see it? Can everybody see how dangerous it is? I'll give you a hand. There it is. Oh, you still can't see it? Let's zoom in. There it is. There it is. It's absolutely rock solid guaranteed that no one's going to tread on that because there's all this fencing around it and you can't see in the picture, but it's actually physically attached to those railings and it's sealed at both ends. How much time and effort did someone put into putting that stuff there to prevent someone... It stayed there for at least 3 weeks because I made sure we walked past it every week just to check if it was still there. At least 3 weeks. One begs the question, why didn't someone just clean this up? And I think that's a perfect illustration of risk management theatre because somebody, I have no doubt that at some point, somebody, probably walking barefoot, I don't know why anybody would ever walk barefoot, but somebody walking barefoot probably trod on a bit of broken glass. So somebody else created a procedure to make sure that nobody ever cuts their foot on broken glass again. And step number 1 said, secure the area. So someone's following that procedure here to do this. You see that everywhere in dysfunctional businesses. That is risk management theatre. I urge everybody to look out for that and question what it's doing. Okay. Dysfunctional Agile. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Does anybody recognize this picture? Yeah, it's SAFE, which I believe lacks the letters U and N at the start of its name. It's so not agile, right? I mean, the very fact that it's got all this coupling through the whole organization is solving the wrong problems. Whoever designed this has not read the Agile Manifesto. I think it's, what do I really think of this? I think this of it. I think it's pretend fake Agile for the C-suite of the organization that's using it so that they can tell the world they're doing Agile, right? And I'm thankful that since I first gave this talk, which as I say is over a year ago now, the world seems to have moved on a bit from fake Agile, and the world is starting to understand it to the extent that this was published earlier this year, which is a US Department of Defense, and they've now got a paper out there, it's been talked about quite a lot, where they're saying fake Agile is a thing, look out for it, which I think is great. Okay, I've got one last slide in this section. These are the anti-agile organizational smells, the ones that I've seen the most, the ones that I think are the biggest indicators that whatever your efforts as software developers might be to be agile, the organization is going to work against you. And I must stress that most of the problems I'm talking about are organizational problems. They're not the problems of the software delivery teams. They're almost always organizational problems. Dysfunctional funding. I think that's the worst problem there is, and my biggest way of encapsulating that is I say to people in the organization, how do you fund your technology? Is technology a cost center or is technology a value creator? If you answer that it's a cost center, that's our fundamental problem that we need to move on from. There's probably a blame culture, organizational silos, that's anti-agile, right? To not be able to own your whole value stream. I've mentioned technology as a cost center. Dishonest reporting. Has anybody heard of watermelon reporting? Yeah, thank you. It's green on the outside, but as soon as you cut into it, it's red. It's when people report back to the PMO, yeah, it's green, it's green, it's green, it's green, and then at the last minute they go, it's red. It's because they know there's going to be punished for reporting that their project is not on track. Lack of trust and empowerment, which kind of speaks to all of those, and this is the one I really hate. We've been talking about this. When people are driven by processes, not by outcomes. So that's what dirty looks like. That's half my talk. Now, the good half. How do we get past dirty? How do we move from dirty to clean? And I just say at this point that what I'm going to talk about now, when I first did this talk a year ago, I was talking about stuff that at ThoughtWorks we were starting to do and starting to try out. In the last year, so I did 8 months of that intervening year working for ThoughtWorks. We put all this stuff into practice. We saw great results, and we're doing the same sort of stuff at Codurance. So I'm happy to talk in the pub to anybody about the specifics of these, but this stuff has worked in the engagements that I've been involved in. So this is the journey we need to go on. We're going to meet our friend, the CTO, again in a moment. I can't see what she's saying because I haven't got my glasses on and I can't read it on that screen, but let's have a look. Oh, yeah. She's saying that. We might have touched on this earlier. This is the first point. Oh, damn it, my beer's spilling. This is the first point that I always say in any new company. Do you actually understand what Agile is and what Agile means? Because too often, people think that Agile and Scrum are the same thing. So let's talk briefly about what is Agile. And it's worth pointing out, it's not Scrum, it's not Kanban, it is not a process, right? Yes, there are processes, there are prescriptions of frameworks or whatever that will support Agile, but it is not them. And it's most definitely not something you can buy off a shelf. Big companies think they can go out and say, how much does it cost me to buy Agile? Forget it. It's a manifesto that has 4 value statements and 12 principles. Simple, that's what Agile is. What are those are the Agile values. And there are 12 principles, and I like to add my own Agile value, which is outcome over process. I often talk about that. I've already mentioned it a few times. So how do we start talking about Agile? Because one of the things that I found as a ThoughtWorks employee was that just like the CTO a few slides ago, she thinks everybody's doing Agile. We can argue about the exact verb to use, but they're not. And it's very difficult as a consultant to go into a company and say to a group of people, you know what, you think you're doing Agile, but you're not, because people are going to get a bit upset about that, right? They're going to say, what, you're telling us that we're not doing our job right? So that was a sort of risk we identified a couple of years ago. So one of the things we came up with was to look at the values, the Agile principles, and say, which of them are we not doing well in this particular engagement? And we come up with a presentation. This was a title I used a couple of years ago. It says July 2018. And the deck was designed with that name, but to cast a light on those Agile principles that weren't being observed. So this is a technique that we came up with to talk to Agile, to effectively do an Agile 101, but without calling it an Agile 101, because that would have caused grief. And that was very successful. Before I left ThoughtWorks, I had to give this deck to various people to explain how to use it and how to move on. It was amazing how they started liking me more when I said I was leaving. I wanted to do some investigation recently, over the last couple of months, because what I started noticing was too often people think that Agile is all about the methods. I've already mentioned this, about the Scrum, about the Kanban, whatever. And I had an inkling, I don't know why, maybe somebody had told me in the pub, that certain people had come up with these Agile pyramid ideas. And I think actually in my colleague now, Sandro at Codurance, he wrote a book called Software Craftsperson. It should be called The Software Craftsperson anyway. And in that book, he talks about how software excellence should be one of the Agile pillars, which I don't necessarily disagree with. So I decided I went online and did a search to find some examples, see if there was an authoritative source. So this was the first one I found on some website. I thought I'd credited it, but I clearly haven't. Maybe that's it down there. What I hate about this one is that it's got methods at the bottom, which implies that methods is supporting everything else. And for me, it's completely the wrong way up, this particular pyramid. So I don't like that one. Then I found this one, which doesn't seem to be HD, and to the extent that it's blown up the screen again. Again, the fact that it's got Agile values at the top, I fundamentally dislike. But also, I hate the fact it's got management practices in here. And this was off some consultant's website that was selling Agile mumbo-jumbo, basically. So my strong suspicion about this one is that these management consultants were trying to sell it to the level above the people that are doing stuff, which is, for me, is fundamentally wrong. If you think that the problem with Agile is it needs to be managed from above and managed effectively, you're back in the realms of safe, you're back in the realms of saying everything's tightly coupled together. So I don't like that one. So eventually, the thing that I ended up showing to my clients was my Agile pyramid, as you'd expect. And I'm not saying this is perfect by any means, and I do hope that I did this yeah. So, right at the bottom, I've got the Agile Manifesto. For me, that underpins everything else. This is the most important thing for us to stick by, learn, understand. Then, I think it's really important that we talk to empowerment and trust amongst our teams. For me, those are the things that derive from the Agile Manifesto, and we need to be talking outcome over processes. Once we've done all that, then I think at the top level, engineering excellence comes in. This is actually following all the good things in the DevOps handbook, in Accelerate, all of those practices. But I think the foundation is the Agile values and the empowerment and the trust amongst all of your teams. Here's our friend again. I know, there are lots of dirty words. When I originally did this talk, I was saying, you know, some words are dirty and you can't get away with it. The point I'm making is that we can use metaphors, always. We find intelligent ways, interesting ways to move on. This is my friend Fu. He works for ThoughtWorks. And I'm sure we've all seen in films and television when there is that green glow on someone's face. It shows that they're a hacker and they're going like this on the computer, right? Must be true, because it's in 24 and stuff like that. And it was way back in war games in the 80s, I remember. So we were making a joke about Fu because he'd done some all-night hack where he was using Jepsen or something. So we wanted this picture for a newsletter. And as you can see, it works pretty well, right? So we must have made a lot of effort to get that to work, right? Well, that's the amount of effort we put into it. And for me, I use this a lot, this very picture in my clients to say, this is what an MVP means, right? That was enough to test the hypothesis that we can make a good photograph, right? And that people laughed. The hypothesis we were testing was, will people find it amusing to see a photo of foo in green? The answer was yes. So if we wanted to industrialize it, maybe we'd spend more money in it. But now we know that there's a market for green photos of foo. Right, this is my second and last quiz. Waste. I'm going to talk a little bit about a technique where we speak the language of the company in which we're working or the people that we're working for. Waste is never a dirty word. People understand that. If you're cost-focused, then you'll actually, waste will resonate. The context of this picture, last summer, summer 2018, England did much better than expected in the World Cup. We got to the semi-finals. We lost. I was at a conference, and I was sitting in the front row just here, watching the match, and obviously my value stream was to get very drunk because after a while when Modric started running the game, it was clear we weren't going to win. Can anybody tell me what the waste is in this picture? Yes. Well done. Which beer would you like, sir? Well, you can have that one. I've got an opener. Got an opener for you. Do you want to do the honours? Well played. The waste is the beer on the floor. Why? Because the value stream was to get me drunk. It's not the pile of rubbish in the bin. It's not the empty bin bags. Cheers, mate. It's the beer on the floor. And my illustration there is it's not always obvious what waste is. Right? I personally believe that code reviews are waste. We can have a pub debate about that for as long as we like, but I think code reviews add no value in general. So it's not always obvious what waste is, but the conversation will resonate with even the most dysfunctional of people. It's a message that's easy to land, particularly when you can change the message around to the value opportunities that you're missing. So for me, it's a good starting point. It's talking the language of your customer. I have an example from this week. I'm not going to read. What was happening was my client is obsessed with us filling in timesheets. My view is it adds no value. I'm like, you know what time we've done. I sent them an email. I gave them the list of all the people and how much we were billing them. Job done, right? No. They want us to travel across London into their office, go onto their systems and log these timesheets. I was like, you're crazy. What's the point? So the cogent points about this is some of the highlights from his email. So he starts off by saying that. It's not acceptable or safe. That made me quite angry. He's saying it's not safe. I actually went on a private conversation and said, I know people that work on oil rigs. They daily risk their lives in their job. Please do not say it's not safe for me not to use Jira, but that's a side conversation. He gives us a 10-point plan to fill in a timesheet. Come on, just fill in the data. And this bit, I think, is, if we need to lose a day in the sprint, I will take the heat. What does this tell us? It tells us that he doesn't understand value. It tells us that he doesn't even value value, but also he's telling us that there's a blame culture in his organization, because he's saying, don't worry, I'll get blamed. You're not going to get blamed. I don't care about being blamed. I'm a consultant. And then he says we're risking 75,000 US dollars in CapEx. I don't even know what that means. Well, I kind of do, but I don't know why it's relevant. Here's the email thread. It took 27 emails to get to that stage. Wow. Here's my email at the end. This is what won the argument. I timed how long it takes us to use Jira because this installation is rubbish. 68 seconds. Admittedly, it's not a scientific test, but based on my previous experience, we can assume the result isn't an outlier. If I open 100 tickets, it's going to take me, I'm going to approximately waste a day a week because of this Jira installation. Do you really want me to use it? That's my question. And then I go on to say, it costs $7 per user per month for the cloud version. Why don't you just install the cloud version? But they can't see past their process and their idiocy. As I say in the last sentence, it's frustrating that there seems to exist a policy that mandates that we're using a thing that is clearly unfit for its primary purpose. They don't even care about Jira as a story repository. They care about it as a cost control mechanism, and it's not doing that. So let's play bingo. Remember the slide from earlier? How many organizational dysfunctions are encapsulated in that one email thread? Well, the funding model there's definitely blame culture. and my ticks are not lining up. Oh, God. Technologies are cost centers there. You know what? I'm just going to go through. They're all there. They're all there. But then I made this slide deck, the final version, yesterday morning, and then at the end it came back. I told them, in the end they said, no, this has to happen. So I said, fine, but I can't come. I'm going to Ukraine. So he says, right, for those that can't come, can we get your usernames and passwords so that Guy can log in and track and submit your time? We can request a password change after the fact. Oh my God. So what do you think I said? Well, if it had been a pub conversation, it would have been 2 words and the second one would have been off. But since it wasn't, I was quite polite. I'm sorry, absolutely not. He then says, since you have access via bookmarks, can you log in from your laptop? Please make sure you submit your timesheet. He sent this to me 10 p.m. last night. I mean, come on. I just said, I don't know. Go away. Leave me alone. So there'll be a postscript to this next time I talk about this, see where this eventually ends up. I'm hoping it ends up with them realizing how stupid they're being. Metaphor for tech debt. Has anybody seen that picture before? I love it. Thank you. So, where am I? Tech debt workshop. I kind of mentioned this earlier to some people. Workshopping is a great way to move forward in your team, and I'm about to go into a bit more detail, but we did a tech debt workshop about a year and a half ago, in a client I was working for, where we were getting product owners and software delivery teams to align on what tech debt was and why it was important. And I forget which was which, and I can't read the writing now, but I think, let's say the blue stickies are tech debt items, like a missing test or a bit of refactoring that we haven't done. The pink things are things that cause tech debt, like pressure for delivery, or I'm being shouted at by a CEO, or there was a defect in production, something like that. And what we found when we were talking about it was that there were these feedback loops going on all around it. It was brilliant. So it just helped everybody learn and get alignment. When we're on this journey, I urge people to bear in mind that do not change all the process all at once. Right? And there are very good reasons for that. I got asked to do this at one of the clients I was working at for ThoughtWorks, and I said, well, the ask was to me from the delivery principal, okay, I want you to tell them how to do stuff. And I said, well, no, I'm not doing that. Right? And I said, well, why not? And I said, well, they need to get there themselves, on the one hand. And also, if I change everything, how on earth do I know what worked and what didn't work? If I change 20 things, it's the same reason why we don't do a big bang release, right? It risks going wrong. People will feel uncomfortable. And then even if it works, how do I know what worked and what didn't? So I urge you, if you're going on a journey, please think of it one thing at a time. This is now a case study. This is the last team I worked with at ThoughtWorks. The first thing we did was sit down and talk about the goals and values of the team. It's amazing how many teams don't know what they do. This exercise is really valuable. Just get your team to say what they do. That's our output. Our purpose is to enable other product teams to deliver value with minimal effort. And then we get 3 value statements. We value maintainability over micro-optimization. We value shared ownership and context over silos. And we value something that I can't read. Then I spent 6 weeks going through a journey with the team, getting them to buy into all the changes that we're doing. We started off by mapping out their process. This is an output after 3 weeks. I think the green stickies is stuff they do during the life cycle of stories. The pink stickies are like notes, and the blue stickies are the outcomes that we think we're driving. So the blue stickies are the important things, right? Because what I'm trying to do is persuade the team to focus on those outcomes. A lot of those outcomes say shared context. So we ended up having conversations about how do we better share context? This is the second half of the same picture. And then finally, after about 3 or 4 journeys, 3 or 4 meetings, we came back to, all right, so all these agile rituals that we do, which of them are actually valuable? So I think the orange stickies were a ritual. The blue stickies are the outcomes. And only the ones that ended up with blue stickies on did we agree, well, they're actually the only ones that are doing us any good. But the whole team came to this conclusion. It wasn't me that put them there. I didn't sit down in front of them and say, do this. The team got to that conclusion on their own. The team is now feeling empowered. The team is moving forward on its own. Here's a nice picture of the team doing stuff without me because I'm not in it. We redesigned the board, but I say we, the team got to this state where the board is nice and clean. The right-hand column is the done column. You can see it's got a ton of stuff in it. There's only 3 cards in progress. That team, when I joined it, had 23 items of work in progress, and they weren't on any board anywhere. It took me a week and a half to actually list out the stuff that was in flight. And then after a few weeks, it looked like this, which we thought was a good win. None of the people in that picture are ThoughtWorks people, by the way. By this stage, we've handed everything back to the client. And this is the client tech lead running his first workshop. So I sat down with him. We designed the workshop. It was around tech debt, actually. And that's him looking pretty nervous at the start, I think. But this is him at the end of the workshop looking really happy with his work. So at that point, I moved away from that team. They didn't need me anymore. They were self-sufficient. They're moving forward. And what we were doing at ThoughtWorks was moving that into every team as we go. I'm running out of time. I do apologize. Yeah, this is back to the earlier slide. If you don't upset people, you're doing it wrong. So steps on the journey. Understand Agile. Use metaphors. They're very powerful. Be pragmatic. Speak their language when it matters, like waste, like cost, and so on. Change one thing at a time, but make sure you empower and involve everybody. And you know what? You'll upset people. You'll deal with it. What does good look like? Do we all understand? Well, goal-orientated teams. That's the first thing I would say. Once everybody knows what they're doing, that's incredibly powerful. You can laminate the goals and the values and use them as a way to make sure that you only do stuff that matters. Anybody familiar with Conway's Law? So Conway's Law is about the top one. I think that's about the expression that he came up with. There's a very famous quote that if you have 4 groups working on a compiler, you'll end up with a 4-stage compiler. So the software you write, the system you write mirrors the organization. This one, I discovered, I'm rereading The Innovator's Dilemma at the moment, which I recommend to everybody. It's not on my last slide, so if you want to remember the book, it's there. It was an anecdote where they're opening up a computer of a competitor, but one of the guys in the room used to work for that competitor. And the story goes, they take the computer apart, look inside it, and he sees the organizational structure of the company reflected in the architecture of that computer, which is a very powerful message. But then in the book, he proposes that if it works that way around, it can also work the other way around. If we decide what the outcomes are and build our teams around it, then it should work that way around. And at ThoughtWorks, we started calling that the reverse Conway maneuver. And I think that's a great thing to aim for. So this is an end state that we should try to get to, autonomous cross-functional teams. I hope I'm preaching mainly to the converted. It's hard to do. You'll find a lot of resistance, but that's a great place to get to. I want everybody to get to a learning culture, particularly if you've got a blame culture. Try and get to a learning culture. Some of the things that will help with a learning culture, book clubs we found really powerful. This slide is later, you don't need to photograph it. Where you read 3 or 4 chapters a week, then come and discuss it. Choose a book, read 3 or 4 chapters, come back to that book next week. And lunch and learns, don't worry, same slide later. Lunch and learns are great. Get an expert in, give a talk. This is the most important part. If there's any takeaways, it's in this last few slides here. This quote here, I think, is wonderful. I'll let you read that. I 100% believe in that. Your only competitive advantage is staying ahead of the competition, is always learning faster than the competition. Experiments should be all the time. You need to make it safe to fail. And also, I even think you should change the language of failing an experiment. You either get this outcome or that outcome. A failed experiment is one that doesn't give you a definite result. That's the way that we should look on it. Always read the prime directive in any of your retros. Make your retros useful. This is a primary learning tool for moving forward. Hopefully people know a lot about retros already. Tell me how you're going to measure me and I'll tell you how I will behave. Right? If you think lines of code is a good metric and you start measuring your developers on that, everyone's going to start writing crap code. Fact. Now, I'll put some color on that. This is a combination. This is an old ThoughtWorks slide, which I've shamelessly stolen, and I can see Fiona nodding and laughing at me. Put your company on here somewhere. This is quite an easy message to say. We need to get over to this side, right? But most bad companies are on this side. So how do we move to that side? This next slide I did make, Fiona. Yes, while I was working for ThoughtWorks. So we decided to break it down for our client and say, let's put some sliders on there that we think that if you improve on these, they will make your organization more agile. You can choose what your sliders are, but you can see that I've got cost center versus value creator for funding technology. And these pointers here, this was where we put that client on here. And to be honest, I think we were being generous. They were rubbish. So these, everybody can make an effort to move them to the right. Now, how do you do that? Well, I was having a chat with one of the other speakers earlier about we make instinctive changes to our software architecture without really understanding whether they were good or bad. How do you know if you're more coupled or less coupled? How do you know if you're more scalable or less scalable? How do you know? And that technique is known as fitness functions. We need to come up with fitness functions that measure scalability, testability, etc., all these entities. So how do we do that? Well, I don't know. I do have some ideas, and we were starting to work on these at ThoughtWorks. Be imaginative. Try and find ways of testing the health of the whole system and constantly report on it. Bear in mind that what you're interested in is an improvement or a deterioration. You're not necessarily interested in the absolute values, right? So what you want to see is trends over time. So if you can come up with a way of measuring coupledness of your system, that's good. And a metric that we used for that was we measured the total hours that tech leads were spending in meetings. Because if you're coupled, you need meetings, right? It's obviously not scientific, but it's good. And we do know that fewer meetings are good. They imply less coupling. So that became a fitness function. This is my last message. Has anybody read Accelerate, the book? If you haven't, you should. There are now proven by the State of DevOps reports to be 4 key metrics for your organization. They are lead time, deployment frequency, mean time to restore, and change fail percentage. Those are highly correlated as leading indicators of organizational performance. You do not need to measure any other stuff. That's a key takeaway. Take that with you. The second thing is this. This is what I'm going to leave you with in a moment. The same book, Accelerate, lists out the 24 key capabilities that are shown to indicate high performance in the 4 key metrics and thus in your organization. So this gave us the idea about 9 months ago at ThoughtWorks on how to actually drive through change and keep driving on change. And it was a simple plan, and this is it. With every team, regularly, we came up with this methodology, and we're still using that. ThoughtWorks is still using it. Codurance is using it. Step 1, list out the 24 key capabilities. 2, there are 2 sections in there that are organizational level. So if you're a team level, you don't have to consider all 24. You're only considering 16, I think. So get the ones out that aren't. But if you're talking about the whole organization, it involves all 24. Step 3, pick the one that you're worst at. Just one. So if the thing that you're worst at is source control, just concentrate on that. Come up with a plan to improve it. But just concentrate on that. Don't worry about everything else. Just fix that. Step number 5, come back a couple of weeks later or whatever is a sensible interval and do this whole process again. And keep doing it, and keep doing it, and keep doing it. Because once you solve your biggest problem, something else will become your biggest problem. Then something else, then something else. And this is the perfect way to carry on staying good. Once you get to a good place in your organization, keep iterating on it in this fashion. So basically, here's my advice. Understand the Agile principles. Always value outcomes over process. Make small, easy to understand changes, the same as in software, the same matters on an organizational level. Measure only the stuff that really matters. Don't bother measuring anything else, right? Because it really doesn't matter. Relentlessly learn and improve. And if you do all this, maybe, just maybe, Agile is not a dirty word. Thank you very much. Sorry I took so long. Do we want to do questions? I'm happy to stand on the stage. I've still got beer. Well, yeah, to that. I think that noise came out of that then.
Еще раз, пожалуйста.
Okay, go on.
although it's maybe not fully related, that you didn't like code reviews.
Yeah.
Раз.
Okay. The question was, I mentioned that I wasn't a fan of code reviews, and can I elaborate on that? Can I just say I just won a bet with myself, because every time I've ever done a talk similar to this, somebody asks that very question. Code reviews, in my experience, I think they're valuable if you've got a fully distributed team, but I don't think that's a great delivery model. So in a fully distributed team, they're pretty much the only way to get feedback on your code, right? I think that most code reviews end up being a discussion of style over content. If one person writes the whole piece of code for a story and then makes a pull request, and then somebody else is invited to do the code review, the person doing the code review doesn't have all the context, right? It's a series, it's listed out as a series of changes in this file, and this file. I don't see, and most of the comments, I've seen threads go on for 2 days where they're talking about the size of the indent. You used the wrong style. You should have used a for each instead of a for I equals. You've done this, you've done this. The discussion is never about how have we got confidence that this works, or does this do the thing that it's supposed to do. Maybe I've only seen dysfunctional code reviews and dysfunctional teams. I 100% agree that there needs to be a way for peer review, but I don't see any useful outcomes that come from a code review that can't be better achieved through pairing. There's also actually definite waste in code review, which is queuing time. When we talk about a value stream, if I take an hour to write the code and the QA person takes an hour to QA it, but it stayed in a queue waiting for a code review for a day, that's the issue. So, and that queuing time is a real cost to everything.
Hello. I have a little follow-up on this code review thing. I believe the process is the problem here, because if developers are given very little time for review, then they have no other options than to concentrate on the code style. But in truth, a review should take about the same amount of time as development of a story. This way, a reviewer can ensure that the story is developed pretty much understandable and as the same way I would do it.
Okay.
And other option would be extreme programming.
Yeah.
So pair programming,
okay,
where basically we are spending the same time. So we spend 2 developer days instead of 1.
Yeah.
But we have 2 developers that have shared perspective on how to do it.
Okay, so my response to that is, yes, it may take 2 developer days. Let's say I take a day to write the code and you take a day to review it.
Or we do it 2 of us. Yes.
Okay, but there was queuing time in between, right? You didn't start reviewing the code instantly that I finished writing it.
Yes.
And secondly, if I made a mistake, we've now got a feedback loop which is unnecessarily extended. If you were sitting next to me for the day when we were writing the code together, that feedback loop is so much shorter that the 2 developer days that it would have cost us originally, you're going to push that out inevitably.
Yeah,
you're going to add queue time and feedback time.
Yeah.
That's
why extreme programming is a superior way to do the code review.
I agree.
And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you know companies whose whose software deliveries do not fail consistently. So consistently successful software deliveries. What companies are those?
Pardon? Who are they?
Which companies are those?
They're the clients that ThoughtWorks had. Not all of them. Well, okay, so I worked for a startup for 9 years before I worked for ThoughtWorks. And we got stuff done. We always thought we were learning on the job and doing things right. But actually, when I reflect on that time working for that company for 9 years, we came up with delivery pipelines, although we'd never read the books on continuous delivery. We came up with Agile process, and we had read a bit about Agile. We split our monolith, but we never read about splitting the monolith because we were outcome focused, right? The CEO and the CTO would say to me as one of the leaders in the team, get the thing done, right? So because we were outcome focused and we were empowered and we owned the stuff that we were doing, we owned our own value streams, that led to these outcomes, even without having the necessary classroom learning or whatever, right? We didn't have any stupid processes in place to stop us doing it. Everybody understood in that company that we were outcome driven and we were value focused. maybe I'm using too many buzzwords, but essentially that got us to where we needed to be. So I would say there, we released some shit software. One big learning I had in that company was we did this massive feature across 3 teams, and it took us a long time and cost a lot of money, and nobody used it. And our learnings from that were the fact that it crossed 3 teams was problematic because it took ages to deliver it. So we reorganized the company on vertical lines as a consequence of this. And it also taught us that we needed to do things smaller. So we needed to make MVPs. I think we knew the word MVP, but our learning from that was the next time we had a new feature that we needed to deliver, it was to do with having a delivery method which was pick the ticket up at the venue rather than do the delivery. So what we did was we added it for 1 venue only in London, and we didn't write the back end. We just had it in a drop down, and the back end implementation basically sent an email to somebody. I don't think it even sent an email. Our database guy ran a query daily which listed off the people that had bought a ticket in that fashion, took it to a guy in the office and said, right, now you have to go and give these tickets to the person. And we ran that for 3 or 4 weeks to verify that the feature was valuable. And when it was valuable, only then did we build the back end. So all of those learnings came organically and naturally, I think, because we were empowered to be outcome driven and to care about those results.
Okay, I have just a few questions more about this company. So what sizes of your teams were? How many people?
In the company I just described?
Yes.
When I left, it was about 40 technology staff in total across about 6 or 7 teams. So the biggest team I was ever leading it got to about 10 or 12 people, and that we realized that was too big, and we basically got more leaders and half the size. We went down to about 6 or 7.
What was the experience of the people in the team? So would you say they were seniors,
varied.
middle engineers?
No, there was a range.
Juniors?
There was a range. Yeah, we had juniors, we had everybody.
Okay, and another question, were you as engineers incentivized by profits of the company? Was your compensation dependent on the sales?
Not directly. The one thing we did very badly at that company was staff relations, and I don't think that company had a good compensation model, so that's one of the reasons why I left.
How exactly did company ensure that you are goal
indirectly? I think we were indirectly, but I don't think that's necessarily a healthy model. But
okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Let's go and get drunk.